I just wanted to show you a picture so that you have an image in your mind of Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk in his 80s now. And he was exiled from his native Vietnam for more than 40 years. And that's why he went and founded his monastery in France called Plum Village. He also founded a monastery here in California. I visited both. And there is one more on the East Coast, which I have not visited. But he's still a peace activist and an author, writes in French, English, and Vietnamese, and has dedicated his life to working to peace. In fact, here's an interesting bit of information for you. Another one of my favorite people, Martin Luther King Jr., nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. That was, I believe, 67. I have to double check. I think it was 67. And he's still teaching, and but he's a simple monk. He lives most of the time in France. And I'm going to be talking about him a little bit today. But I didn't just want it to be a name, that went sort of floating by your head. I wanted you to have an image. I wanted you to visualize something when you hear his name, to really have a better idea of who he was. And so, with that said, I want to talk about emptiness today. And as you know, we've concluded our section on Hinduism, and we're now talking about Buddhism. And the ordinary place where most people start is with the Four Noble Truths. But I don't want to start there. I want to start with emptiness. It is possibly the most philosophically difficult place to start, but I want to start there anyway, because I don't think it has to be philosophically difficult. I think it's largely misunderstood, and I want to talk about it in a way that makes it less weird or less confusing. How many of you have heard of that word emptiness in conjunction with Buddhist studies? A few of you. And I'm just curious, what comes to your mind when you think of the word emptiness?
Not being present.
Not being present? Oh, that's interesting. Go ahead.
The idea of trying to empty your mind and not think of anything is extremely.
Okay, the idea of trying to empty your mind, but it's difficult to do. So you're thinking about the practice of meditation. Okay. And you're thinking of that it means something like not being present. That's interesting, kind of opposite to what Billy said.
Yeah, so kind of just not, not being present in the moment, just
Okay. It's an okay place to start. Go ahead.
Freedom. Freedom. When you don't
Freedom?
have anything, you have nothing to lose. You're not dependent on anything.
To not be dependent. That's interesting he says that. To not be dependent on anything. Something like political freedom comes to mind. Okay, so we've got some work to do today, because if I could say something, and for the sake of piquing your interest, say it's kind of opposite to that in a way, because it has everything to do with dependence, but not in the way you might suspect. You see, Buddhism really starts, even before the Four Noble Truths, Buddhist philosophy starts with what you're writing, what the author of the text calls the 3 marks of existence, or in some books, the 3 marks of reality, which are impermanence, anatman, and suffering. So impermanence and anatman are really just different angles on the same observation of life, of this thing, this suchness, this thing we can't put our finger on. Impermanence is simply what Buddha witnessed by sitting. It's what he experienced for himself in his own meditations, and he would urge you to do the same and not to take his word for it. That the universe is constantly in motion, constantly moving. It's in a process of change at any moment. Everywhere you look, nothing stands still. Reality is impermanent. Anatman is really just a different way of pointing out the same observation. You've seen the word Atman in the context of Hinduism. What happens when you stick an A at the beginning of a word? It negates it. It flips it to its opposite, something like that. For when I say Anatman, and we know that Atman in the Hindu context, normally translated as soul, points to this eternal essence, your being, who you are, really, that carries over from existence to existence. But Anatman suggests that there is no soul or no self. And this has been the most perplexing thing about Buddhism. People say, what is this thing Buddha said? That I'm no self? Does he say that I'm nothing? That I have no soul? And it's troubling. And so my goal today is to make it less troubling. What is really meant by Anatman, no self or no soul? Troy.
Does it mean like your personality carries through on your lifetime, not so much your soul?
Yes and no. It's that what it really means is that that personality is subject to the same flow that the universe is subject to. But when we get hung up, mistakenly, on the idea of a permanent identity, it leads to suffering. And that takes us into the Four Noble Truths, which will take us into next week. And so I'll set that to the side for now. Because we'll see that these first two kind of foundation points for Buddhism will take us into the heart of the philosophy of emptiness. The philosophical term, and it's kind of a mouthful of it's an academic term, is dependent origination. That's the philosophical way of describing emptiness. And I want you to know it, and that's why I put it down. It's just the academic way of talking about emptiness. The other words we'll get to. To be clear, to make sure that we're connecting the dots all the while, to talk about impermanence is to talk about the nature of the self, which is also changing, is to talk about emptiness. We're not talking about different things. Emptiness is just what you call that universe of change. It starts by having us look more deeply at the habitual way of looking at the self, the way we usually think about ourselves. We have a habit of looking at ourselves in a certain way. But there's a tradition within Buddhism. And it starts with the question, who am I? And some teachers would have their disciples meditate on this question, who am I? Like in your readings, there's a little bit about that, and it's kind of a fun little portion to read through. Who am I? We're always looking for an answer. But in this case, it's the asking of the question that turns the key.